Okay, so hello. I'm Will Fox. You know me. I am here with Dr. Stephen S. Knott. Uh, Stephen F. Knott, excuse me. He is the Thomas and Mabel Guy Professor in American History and Government at Ashland University, and an emeritus professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And more important than that, a couple of my friends who I really trust told me he was a good guy to talk to. So beyond that very wonderful title, a couple people I trust said that this is somebody who could really bring me some wonderful insights. And I've read his book, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, The Decline into Demagoguery and the Prospects for Renewal. And it was something that I devoured while I was working on my recent video on the presidency. And so I'm really happy to have you here. Thanks for sitting down to talk with me.
Well, thanks for having me, Will. It's always a pleasure to speak to friends of my good friends, Tyler and Connor. So I'm looking forward to this interview.
Wonderful. And and hopefully it's one of many to come. And I did, do a little Googling, and I saw that you give talks and stuff. So it sounds like you're out there sharing your ideas, and that's wonderful. And so the first thing that I saw from you that challenged my thinking was that when I was in undergrad and graduate school, and we were told to think about Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, generally I remember I had a professor who said, a lot of these people were political rivals, but in general, Madison's notes are ones that we can trust, that he was making a good faith effort to keep a record, and, politics of the moment aside, and the fact that people might posture one way or another, that they don't genuinely believe in maybe a closed door debate, that, what Madison wrote down is probably reflective of what happened there to a great extent. And specifically in the moment in your book that challenged me was when we were talking about Hamilton's view on the executive.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if I'm thinking about Madison's notes and Hamilton's words through Madison incorrectly. When Hamilton suggested an authoritative executive for life, one that kind of looked a little bit like a king. Should I not be like taking Madison's interpretation of Hamilton so literally? Do you think Hamilton was maybe playing a game in the Constitutional Convention to move the conversation?
Yeah, it's a terrific question, Will. And I mean, let me reassure you, on the whole, I think you can trust Madison's notes
Okay.
on the Constitutional Convention. I don't want to undermine your faith in that, but it is true. We know for a fact that Madison did go back in the decades following the convention and make some alterations. And some of those alterations, yeah, I know. Some of those alterations were, I think, designed to put Hamilton in a somewhat more tainted light. And the seminal work on this is by a law professor named Sarah Binder, who, really lays out the instances where Madison basically used a 19th century version of whiteout and went back and made a few alterations. And look, your professor was right. I mean, these people were political animals. I hate to use that term. They were of the highest sort, no doubt. But they did have partisan and ideological beliefs. And of course, Hamilton broke with Jefferson and Madison over a number of issues. And I do think there's enough evidence to support the contention that Madison made a few changes in order to make himself look better and to make Hamilton look worse. Now, having said that, it's also true that Hamilton's speech of June, I think it's 18th, 1787, makes a pitch for essentially an elected monarch. There's no way around that. And he himself, would defend that position in later years. The person would be elected, but they would be elected for life. Mm-hmm. And which means Jimmy Carter, I guess, would still be president of the United States as we speak.
The stress might have gotten to him, though.
Yeah, that's true. So yes, on the whole, I think you can trust Madison, but he did make some alterations, I think, for partisan or ideological purposes.
Right.
And so, that's kind of a nuanced answer, but I hope it's
no, I think it's a really good one. And so now my question is that what Madison might have been doing with that 18th, 19th century whiteout was trying to paint Hamilton as a bit of a loon.
Yes.
But we both know that he wasn't a loon. He was, even if he was arguing for something that to us seems a bit absurd, a president for life, that he didn't intend for it to be the Leviathan or something from Thomas Hobbes. It was meant to be, as all the founders discussed, some sort of a statesman,
Yes.
someone who had the interest of the Republic at heart. And so I'm wondering if you could tell me how Hamilton squared the idea of a executive for life, which to most people sounds like a call for something much more, to use modern parlance, authoritarian,
Yeah.
with what he actually believed, which was an executive that had the Republic's interest at heart.
Yeah, I mean, again, another terrific question. Look, he always argued that these political officers of the federal government should be elected. For him, it was a question of giving the president enough time to implement his agenda. Hamilton is all about injecting as many elements of stability and permanence into the American system as possible. And so what he's doing in this June 18th speech is trying to put one body of the elected government in a position of power for a lengthy period of time, again, believing that stability, that permanence, that the rule of law requires a kind of stable hand at the top. That's what he's about. Now, the argument that he's an authoritarian, which really begins with Jefferson and his acolytes, it's a distortion, but I get it in that the Jeffersonians and some of their anti-federalist ancestors believed that frequent elections were the way to check abuses in power. Hamilton is on the other side of that coin, believing that the rule of law, that obedience to the Constitution requires, again, a kind of permanence, a kind of stability that he thought a president elected for life would provide. Let me just add one quick thing, Will.
Sure.
And you hinted at it in your first question. This may have been a tactic on Hamilton's part to make a 4-year term of a president with unlimited re-eligibility seem much more palatable than his somewhat extreme proposal for a president elected for life. This may have been, in other words, a tactic to make some of the other advocates of a stronger central government and a stronger presidency seem more reasonable.
Right. And you mentioned Jefferson. I know you had you wrote extensively on him in the book too. And of course, this dialogue, if we can call it that, between the more Hamilton-like folks and the Jefferson-like folks, kind of, it's a preface, I think, to what we would see later on with Wilson. I mean, I think about Jefferson saying that maybe the Constitution should just get reset every generation. I forget how exactly it's phrased, but I think it was a little bloodier, his metaphor. But the point being that, that things should shift. And so I thought it would be smart to take a broader view, because the context of this conversation, of course, was the reason I started writing was because of the Supreme Court decision on presidential power. Yeah. And it's something that's on everyone's mind right now, because we do have a number of populists in the political theater that are making noise. And so, of course, one question that a lot of folks have, and one that was touched on in the Supreme Court decision, was simply, what was the intent for the executive? Like, what is the purpose of the president? And we've dabbled in it a little bit by referencing Hamilton and Jefferson. But could I ask for just a broader perspective, perhaps from you, on what, if we amalgamated all of the founders' thoughts, which imperfectly, into one blurry vision of what the president should be, could you describe that person for me?
Sure. With the sort of reservation that to describe the founders' position, it is a fairly diverse group, not so much racially or ethnically, but philosophically diverse. But with that disclaimer, I'll do my best. Right. I think certainly for Washington, for Hamilton, for James Wilson of Pennsylvania, and even for James Madison, at least during the Constitutional Convention, They have learned a lesson from the American Revolution, which was that you cannot run a government, particularly in wartime, by committee. So you needed a strong commander-in-chief. They were all reassured by the prospect that George Washington would be that first commander-in-chief. So that's an important part of this story.
Right.
But they hoped that this would be a president who would take his Article II responsibilities seriously. One of the mandates in Article II is that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And this may mean that the president at times has to defy public opinion, may have to even stand up against the majority to protect minority rights. It's a president that's not rooted in popularity, but it's a president rooted in the Constitution. And this is really, I think, where you see a split ultimately between Jefferson and Hamilton, and Washington on Hamilton's side. I should make this point. You know, Hamilton's positions were basically Washington's positions, but they wanted a president who would take care that the laws be faithfully executed, who would not respond to the whims of public opinion. Every time public opinion shifted, president should not necessarily follow suit. That's their conception. That's the constitutionalist Washington and Hamilton conception. Jefferson's conception is more rooted in public opinion, rooted in the will of the majority. And as you mentioned, Will, Jefferson did favor the idea of revising constitutions every generation. And in the view of Hamilton, that was craziness because Hamilton believed, as I said, in permanence and stability, whereas Jefferson believed the dead should not govern the living. So there's a philosophical break fairly early on, but at the Constitutional Convention, the notion of a president as a head of state enforcing the rule of law, I think, was shared by most of the delegates at the convention.
It's so interesting with Jefferson. This is a sidebar, but just generally you think of him as a man of like the yeoman farmers, you think of states, you think of smaller government, and yet, I mean, at his core, Jefferson was a bit of an eccentric, and some of his like views on the revolutions and the revolution in France, for example, you're taken aback, and it's another one where you're like, oh, he was conservative in some ways and not in others, and it's really interesting. And Hamilton, the same dynamic plays out. Like he was this big executive guy, and yet at the same time, like the idea that the laws should be slow is something that Aristotle, if I remember correctly, it's been a while, would have thought made a lot of sense. Yes. So I wanted to ask about the concept that would come later on in the Wilsonian years of the difference between a Newtonian constitution and a Darwinian constitution, which when I read, I find a little intimidating because I'm like, do we really need these, like, we really need to introduce these confusing scientific terms? But of course, to some of the late 19th century thinkers, Darwinian evolution applied directly to politics. Yes. And so it wasn't just these like strange conceptual political metaphors, it was somewhat literal. So before we talk a little bit about how the presidency shifted in the 19th century, I just thought we'd put a pin in the original Constitution, so to speak. What about it was Newtonian? Is that metaphor, does the metaphor make sense definitionally before we describe whether that's an ideal form of a constitution?
I think so, Will, although I have to confess I'm not an expert necessarily on Newton, but
yeah, me neither.
Most of the folks at that convention, I would say perhaps all of them, believed that there were certain fixed laws of nature. And, human beings are the same in 1787 as they will be in 2024 or as they were in 1266. It doesn't matter. Certain things are fixed. The sun is going to rise in the east every morning. It's going to set in the west, et cetera, et cetera. Things are fixed. Therefore, you have to take that, human nature being fixed, you have to take that as a given. And they would have argued that human nature is fixed, and it's fixed in such a way that it's deeply flawed. And that the idea of perfection, that the idea that human beings are moving toward some type of perfectibility would have horrified and did horrify a John Adams or an Alexander Hamilton. It
Yeah.
did not horrify Thomas Jefferson. He did believe, he got caught up in sort of the French revolutionary thinkers who did believe that mankind was progressing in a certain direction toward perfectibility. And therefore, if you believe, as Jefferson did, then systems of government need to change. They need to evolve over time. And in Jefferson's view, they need to evolve and change with every generation.
And
Jefferson believed the dead should not govern the living.
it is seductive too. The idea that we're progressing, that the most popular quote that today that represents that, I think, is the arc of history is long but bends towards justice.
Yes.
It's a seductive idea that, and it's one, of course, humans are story-based beings. We want to believe there's a beginning, a middle, maybe a moment of scariness that then pays off with a wonderful ending. Who doesn't want to believe that? And of course, if you have a political project of any kind, it makes sense to tell it as a story. You don't want to just explicate why it's logical. You want to tell people, here's where we started and here's where we're going. And it's interesting to see that there is a darker side to perfection and progress. There's a dystopian element to it that's kind of creepy. And I that's why I like John Adams' cynicism quite a bit, actually, the older I get.
Me too. I live about 12 minutes from John Adams's birthplace in Massachusetts. And while I'm a Hamiltonian at heart, I do think that the sort of darkness of John Adams, that New England Puritanism, has its place, or should have more of a place in American political thought than perhaps it does.
I agree. I think, it's wonderful that we have the rhetoric of Jefferson in our presidential speeches. That some of the lofty rhetoric ends up being some of the stories we tell ourselves. But there is something charming about Adams just being like, nah, people are kind of dumb. And like, we're probably not going to keep our republic. Like, it's kind of like, great.
John Adams is definitely Old Testament. You could argue that Jefferson, this is separate from the question of whether he was a Christian or not, but Jefferson is not Old Testament. Mankind is capable of changing. The average man is capable of making the very important decisions that governments make. So Jefferson's an eternal optimist, certainly an idealist. Hamilton and Adams far less so.
Yeah. I wanted to ask as well about, I kind of forgot to just ask about the potential, the sort of kinetic energy of the presidency at its initiation. So we do have a concept of what the president should be. And we do have it's like the idea between drafting an idea and putting it into practice. But pretty soon after the Constitution is ratified and we have a president or two, we get to Thomas Jefferson, and this idea of a democratic infusion and a majoritarian and a popular presidency starts to take form. And we would see that played out in a little bit earlier in the Whiskey Rebellion. We'd see a president that has the power to use the military against people. We would see that threatened to be used in the nullification crisis in the years of Andrew Jackson. And then, of course, we would see it literally play out. We would see the potential powers of the president become actualized during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln in wartime. And something that I've come to think about is that, and I don't know if I actually believe this, and it's part of the reason I'm happy to talk to you, is I've started to think about whether the presidency, it's not that the presidency has grown, it's the presidency has always sort of had these small powers. And what we've relied on over the years is good faith actors, more or less, to occupy the office and to have the greater good in mind, so to speak, the republic in mind. And that, theoretically, these powers were always there. That the power to enact the Union in the Lincoln presidency, that potential was always there. And the powers that perhaps we're seeing today are made explicit through the Supreme Court are not new powers of the president, but are powers that were always there within the checks and balances of the Congress and the judiciary. I realize that's a really, really big question to ask, but do you think I'm onto something there, or do you think I've maybe overinterpreted a narrative?
No, you are definitely on to something. Again, you have to be careful when you say all.
Yeah.
But the key framers the Washington, Madison, Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson, all believed in this idea. The fancy term for it is prerogative power, that
Right.
the executive possesses the ability to, at times, act where the law is silent, or in drastic situations, drastic emergencies, even perhaps act against the law for the greater good. And you see Jefferson defending this repeatedly. So Jefferson, in a way, takes a very Hamiltonian position on this notion of presidential emergency powers. And then, of course, Lincoln, as you mentioned, really puts it into practice, in part by, in some ways, accepting at least part of Jefferson's argument that the highest duty of a statesman in times of crisis is to preserve the political order. And if that means, suspending habeas corpus without Congress approving it, so be it. The circumstances demanded that. And the Civil War was certainly one of those dire emergencies. So the seeds of a kind of emergency presidential power, I believe, as you say, are there right from the start. The problem for me, and I'm not a critic of that concept. The problem for me with my sort of dispute with Jefferson, and not to put myself anywhere near the same level as Thomas Jefferson, but my dispute with Jefferson and some of the more populist presidents, particularly of the 20th century, is they kind of mainstream this emergency concept of presidential power almost as a day-to-day affair.
Right.
Teddy Roosevelt's stewardship theory, that the president should be acting, right up until the point where the law prevents him, again, on not necessarily emergency matters, but almost routine governing. And to me, that is a dangerous concept.
And of course, that gets put on steroids with the friction-free government
Yes.
concept from Woodrow Wilson.
Exactly.
And actually, just before you made that detour, I was about to take us there anyway, because I wanted to talk about the non-emergency situations that I think are more concerning. I think most people, and again, you said there's problems when you say all, so we'll just say most. I think most people understand that when there's a war, when there's a genuine emergency, when there's a crisis, that we have an executive for a reason, and that makes a lot of sense. But there's 99% of the time when that's not going on, and there's been a general development over the years towards a more popular presidency, it sounds like the seeds for that are laid in the Jefferson years. I was hoping we could skip ahead a little bit to Andrew Jackson.
Sure.
Could you, just in broad brushstrokes, tell me a little bit about your take on Andrew Jackson's contribution to this popular presidency? And do you think it's better to talk about this separately, like the emergency powers section, and then
I do.
Okay, so could you distinguish that a little bit for me too?
Sure. And it's a terrific question, because it is, in my view, it is separate. So I see this emergency power to deal with crises of a war, or a civil war in Lincoln's case, as having deep roots in the American founding and deep roots in the political theory of John Locke and others who greatly influenced our founders. But what I think Jefferson and especially Jackson do is they opened the door for this populist presidency, one that is entirely, in some ways, its legitimacy is rooted entirely in public opinion, entirely in the will of the majority. And Jackson's very upfront about this. He repeatedly says the majority is to govern, and there should be as few impediments as possible to the will of the majority. In other words, he's very, I would say, contemptuous of separation of powers, of checks and balances. And you see this especially in his battles with John Marshall's Supreme Court.
Right.
So there's a contempt for the rule of law. There is an elevation of majority rule at the expense of minority rights. And it is during the age of Jackson that white male voters, the franchise is expanded for them, but the franchise for free blacks in many of New England, well, not so much New England, but many northeastern and mid-Atlantic states is restricted. So the downside of that Jacksonian principle that the majority is to govern. The downside is that the price is paid by unpopular minorities, be they free blacks at the time of Jackson or Native Americans at the time of Jackson. That's where the problem lies, in my view, not with this notion of prerogative power, but with the sort of popularization, that's not a good word, the democratization of the presidency.
Mm-hmm. This seems like a good moment to ask about some of the entrenched injustice in society. So one of the benefits of democratization, it's in the name, is that more people get to be part of decision making. And I think as a general principle, the idea that people should have a say in their governance is something that most Americans and people in the West would agree upon, and even folks in other systems would at least give tacit support to the idea of. No one would. I mean, the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea at least tries to nod to this notion because it's such a universally agreed idea, at least in concept. And one of the challenges, of course, when describing American history is the contrast between the brilliance of the system, the brilliance of the Constitution, the brilliance of the people who created it, and of course the injustices that end up being baked into it. And I think about the idea that, the obvious one is that slavery was baked into the Constitution, the 3/5, and then the prohibition of the slave trade after 1808, I believe it was, or 1807, implies that there is a system like that in our country that will continue. And I don't want to relitigate the years before the Civil War, more just to ask, could the democratization of the presidency, it sounds like you don't believe that the democratization of the presidency could be used to solve problems of this nature, to solve injustices in society. Could you tell me, if that's true that you don't believe it, could you tell me why you don't believe it, and maybe what, like, is this something for Congress to deal with? Is this something for the states to deal with? How does society rectify injustice in an ideal world?
Again, another terrific, thoughtful question. Look, the founders had, and I hold, a very deep and abiding belief that the tyranny of the majority is the greatest tyranny of all. And by further democratizing American government, I would argue in the early 19th century, from Jefferson up through Lincoln, you see a solidification of this idea that the majority is to govern, and you see steps taken, mostly at the state level, but not entirely, to solidify the place of slavery in the American regime. And that is a direct consequence of further democratization. In other words, the expansion of white male suffrage. What I see is at least an earlier conception, and granted, they kicked the can down the road when it came to slavery. And certainly the 3/5 compromise is nothing to be proud of by any stretch. But I think there was the hope, and there was a movement toward abolition. And the founders paid a price in order to win ratification in the southern states by kicking the can down the road. But again, the hope was that slavery was on the road to extinction. That comes to a grinding halt in some of the presidencies of Jefferson, Jackson for sure, Pierce, Buchanan, many of the others, who were all, by the way, members of the Jefferson-Jackson political party. Now,
and it might have continued in the Lincoln years, and then Lincoln himself was ready to let it continue.
Yeah, true. Yeah. But again, that healthy understanding of the tyranny of the majority, I think we've lost, and I think that is a consequence of alterations made by presidents like Jefferson and Jackson and their political movements. Whereas the protection of minority rights and the resolution of human rights abuses, again, it's not to be found in the will of the majority. It's to be found in the rule of law. It's to be found in the Bill of Rights. And it's later to be found in the Civil War amendments, which rectified those mistakes of the founding generation, if you will.
And if there are further, I think about the 19th Amendment. So in 1920, the women's suffrage.
Yes.
these are I mean, there was a popular movement to bring women the vote, and then that was done not through executive order, but through congressional action and ratification through the states.
Fair point. Yeah.
So I just want to ask real quick. This is not topical, but it's 11:37 as we're recording this, and I was just wanting to make sure we're doing okay on time. We're in the meat of it now. Do you have a hard stop or anything I should be thinking about?
If we could stop at the top of the hour, Will, if that works.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
Then I think we can have a great 23 minutes or so more of conversation. I'm glad I asked before we got too lost. So then, let's talk about the end of the 19th century. Let's talk about some of the context that brings us our most vocal advocate of the popular presidency, Woodrow Wilson.
Yes.
So I want to start because I share, like many people, I'm not a huge fan of this guy. The more you learn about him, the more there is to dislike.
Absolutely true.
Let's give his sort of context some legitimacy here for just the moment. I mean, we are talking about an era in which trusts are real. We are talking about a gilded era in which, I don't know if it was Johnstown, where there was aristocrats had like this dam built above a big industrial town, and
right.
they broke, and a bunch of people we have a society in which there are genuine injustices, and particularly there's not economic democracy, at least definitionally. And so this is the context into which some of these ideas of the popular presidency emerge. And Wilson, for example, the question I have for you is, Wilson thought that one of the ways to rectify these problems was to have the president be a counterbalance to some of the powers in society. And he yearned for things like parliamentary democracy to be infused into the American system of government. Could you talk a little bit about what Wilson saw and what he wanted to bring to the presidency even before being elected, while he was still the president of a university?
Princeton.
At Princeton, right.
Yeah. Look, your initial point that there were incredible abuses during the Gilded Age of working men and women, no question about it. And the federal government belatedly, I think, rose in response, and much of the steps they took were needed and made, I think, for a more just political order, no question. So I wanted to get that out front. Wilson initially favored changing the American system to a parliamentary system. He was impressed by the way some of the European, particularly United Kingdom, functioned. He wanted that kind of party discipline that a prime minister has. The separation of powers in the United States had prevented that. Wilson wrote a book called Congressional Government, which was a very disparaging look at late 19th century Congress, how decisions were made behind closed doors, how members of Congress who were not in positions of power, were basically neutered. So he wants a more dynamic, disciplined, party-centered government with the president, in a sense, becoming the prime minister. And the point of all this is to get things done, to circumvent separation of powers, to particularly circumvent a conservative Supreme Court that was striking down all sorts of progressive legislation, both at the state and national level. Where and I understand that motive, and by the way, Teddy Roosevelt shared this view as well.
Right.
I understand the motive of both Wilson and Roosevelt. Where I tend to break with them is that I think they went beyond where they had to go. In other words, by, in a sense, trashing the Constitution, disparaging the framers. I think there was a kind of contempt for the rule of law. And again, that same celebration of the rule of the majority, and a sort of blindness to the possibility that rule of the majority can be exploited by demagogues. By the way, I think we're living in an era where that is exactly the case. But perhaps we can get to that later.
Yeah, that's the next question. How do you do that? Yeah. That's twice now. So go ahead. Sorry.
Just a final point, Will. You know from reading the book, I cite William Howard Taft as an example of a president who pursued progressive legislation, who actually filed more antitrust suits than Teddy Roosevelt. who actually set aside more conservation land than Teddy Roosevelt, but he gets slighted because he was not as dramatic. He was not as overtly critical of the other branches of government. He was not overtly critical of the founding and of the Constitution. So the point with Taft is you can pursue a progressive agenda and not trash the rule of law. And in my view, there were times when both TR and Wilson did, in a sense, trash the rule of law.
And Taft, notably, can be visited in Arlington Cemetery as well. But unlike JFK's grave, it's not as celebrated or visited.
That's right.
I do have a great appreciation for Taft, especially the fact that he's one of the few presidents who's like, I don't even want to be here. I want to be down the street in the Supreme Court.
That's an important point, Will. Taft refused to play the sort of popularity game that both TR and Wilson were very good at, TR especially. TR knew how to stroke the press. Taft refused to do that. He did not play what Hamilton would call the little arts of popularity, and it cost him. And there's a reason why nobody goes to his grave at Arlington other than you, Will, because he didn't play that game, and that cost him in those surveys of presidential greatness. As far as I'm concerned, Taft should be estimated in a far more favorable light than he is.
Yeah, well, let's start a campaign. I agree. I wanted to ask about so Hamilton also wrote about we need a strong executive, but we need to make sure demagogues don't come. Most egregious paraphrasing ever. Wilson also theoretically gave some thought to this in, I think it is constitutional government in the U.S. I know he also wrote a couple other things that sound like Alexis de Tocqueville knockoffs, including his thesis, but I think it's in constitutional government in the USA when he distinguishes between the idea, and you quote it in the book, which for anyone watching this, again, it's The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, Dr. Knott. I don't think I can link on Nebula, but I'll link to it on Patreon. And if I ever use this in a full video, I'll definitely link to it in the video description. Okay.
Back to the fund my retirement, Will.
Yes. one book sold at a time. Wilson wrote in constitutional government in the US, I believe, that there's a difference between a person who is a popular president but obedient to the, quote, permanent purposes of the public mind, and a popular president who is more of a demagogue who would, quote, trim to the inclinations of the moment. I don't know if Wilson actually knew the difference between these two things or thought about it that much. Do you have any evidence that he gave it more thought than just words?
I do not have more evidence, Will, and I've looked long and hard. And I do think this is one of Wilson's, the greatest sort of chink in the armor of Wilson's argument, a kind of dismissiveness towards the threat of demagoguery, towards that tyranny of the majorities that the framers were well aware of. He shares a kind of Jeffersonian rosy view, I think, of human nature, which I would argue is not warranted. And I think we are seeing the fruits of many of Wilson's reforms in our current politics, where the guardrails are completely gone. And as long as you can sell yourself to the American public as if you are marketing, deodorant or whatever, you have a shot at the presidency if you have high name recognition. That's not how it's supposed to work. And again, I think Wilson had a kind of blasé attitude towards any sort of screening mechanisms that might wean out those individuals who simply should not be anywhere near the Oval Office. The framers came up with the Electoral College. That really didn't work, but it was replaced by a party system that did produce a lot of mediocre presidents. Chester Alan Arthur, take your pick.
How dare you? How dare you? Chester Arthur is my favorite president now.
Oh, sorry. Those party leaders in those smoke-filled rooms, they knew who had the drinking problem. They knew who the dangerous characters were, the ones who were overly corrupt as opposed to minorly corrupt. They weeded those folks out. We have no guardrails left anymore, and that's in good measure to Wilsonian changes. I mean, Wilson at one point argued for national primaries for both political parties to be held on the same day. because he wants to remove the party leadership from the presidential nominating process. And again, that's a reflection. Sorry?
He proposed that in person in Congress,
Yeah.
which was something that hadn't been done in a while.
No, and look, that's right. He restores the in-person State of the Union address. He's somebody who, in his dismissal of the framers, I would argue, dismissed their very appropriate fears of demagoguery and of the tyranny of the majority, and we're paying the price today.
And so now we can finish our pylon of Wilson by just saying what the most extreme sort of expressions of this thinking are, as he is president of the United States. And I think it would be unwise to not mention his links to the Klan and his display of the film Birth of a Nation. I mean, that's a deep mark on our nation that he did that, and that he had such deeply racial biases and brought that into the federal government in terms of segregation of the executive branch, etc. Not that there wasn't deep racism there before, but he was a boy of the South,
yes,
as am I. So I love the fact that I'm from Texas, and I just know we have to look at these things with clear eyes. But perhaps more relevant to our conversation today, and in the idea of what a super powerful unchecked presidency might look like, people who were concerned at the recent Supreme Court case about the powers of the presidency, and I know the really popular thing that people were saying was like the president can drone strike his political enemies and things, and it's he's immune from the law. But Wilson had something that he helped to develop through executive order called the Committee on Public Information, CPI, and it's something you wrote about in your book as well. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that and show for folks that about a century ago, well, we had some scary executive power being used during World War I that, in the case of Eugene Debs, did actually have an impact literally on a political rival. Yeah,
excellent. Another excellent question. So Wilson believed in a president who could be, as he put it, as big a man as he wants to be. Again, I find that a very dangerous aphorism. And you begin to see the fruits of this limitless, expansive conception of presidential power during Wilson's leadership of World War I, where, as you mentioned, Will, he creates a domestic propaganda agency that really is manipulating the American media here at home. But perhaps even worse, he imprisons his government, his Justice Department, goes after people like Eugene Debs and other people who were opposed to the war. So if you were a political figure or a newspaper editor publishing anti-war editorials, you were a target of a new agency, relatively new agency called the Bureau of Investigation, led by an unknown bureaucrat at the time named J. Edgar Hoover. You were likely to find yourself in some hot water. And this is the downside to this expansive conception of presidential power. And now, look, I earlier defended the notion of presidential prerogative power in times of emergency. But again, this seems to me to be a dangerous extension of a legitimate doctrine. When the president uses that to silence political opponents, that is clearly a violation of the rule of law, a violation of the Bill of Rights. And Wilson's record on that matter, and as you mentioned, Will, on racial matters, is absolutely atrocious. Yeah. And I'm glad he's finally getting his due. I'm involved in those. Every 4 years, they do these presidential greatness surveys.
Yeah. Which in itself is sort of part of the problem.
It is part of the problem, exactly. Yeah. I've done my best to try to bring Wilson down in those rankings, and I must admit I've had some success.
Yeah, I'm glad, and I do notice. I want to jump into the present very quickly, but I also didn't want to blow over the fact that Wilson is not just an isolated person, but he would go on to influence future presidents. So
yes.
Calvin Coolidge wasn't in the mold of Woodrow Wilson, but FDR,
yes,
being a man of his time and being influenced, was aware. LBJ probably as well. Could you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, FDR works in Wilson's cabinet. He's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and the Navy Department at that time was very important had full cabinet rank. And of course, in the First World War, it was of even greater importance. So FDR, in a sense, is learning at Wilson's knee. He absorbs this notion of the president being as big a man as he wants to be. FDR is going to influence Lyndon Johnson. All of these mid-20th century Democratic Party presidents are in a way heirs to Woodrow Wilson. And they accept this notion that the president can and should be as big a man as he wants to be. Now, again, in the case of FDR, it's tough because I try to make the point in my book. FDR was faced with two great crises, the Great Depression and the Second World War. And I think in both of those cases, there's strong arguments to be made in defense of FDR's actions. Where I break with FDR is, again, a kind of trashing, in FDR's case, directly, overtly trashing the Supreme Court. I understand why he was frustrated with them, but there might have been a way to get around that without arguably undermining the place of the judiciary in our system of separation of powers. And that, to me, is a very dangerous precedent that FDR set.
Another legacy of Woodrow Wilson is the primary system.
Yes.
They developed until about 1968. There was a huge kerfuffle, to understate a little bit, at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. And basically, since the 70s, primary voters have picked nominees.
Yes.
And it's developed over time. We had, I think, a long shot guy win in Iowa, Jimmy Carter. When no one would call Jimmy Carter like an out of control populist. We did see the popular movements, the popular conservative movement under Ronald Reagan, start to push out maybe more traditional party types like George H.W. Bush, et cetera, et cetera. We end up where we are today. And I think a large part of the growth of the popular presidency can be attributed to the fact that you have to be good at the popular arts to win a national primary. I think that's self-explanatory. And you said it in the book as well. So we do get some heroic moments. I think the idea that we had nominated the first black man in American history over the party insider is undoubtedly like an interesting and wonderful development of the primaries nationalization. It wouldn't have happened without it, probably. We also got we haven't said his name yet, but we got Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could just we're about 5 minutes left. So I think everyone's in agreement that maybe and anyone who's watched my videos in the past knows that I'm heavily influenced by James Caesar and his thoughts on presidential primaries and the democratization. So let's just skip ahead to your conclusions in the book. And one of them is that without reform, Donald Trump might just be the start. That maybe what we're actually seeing is this natural development into something more demagogic over time. Do you think we're really more at the beginning rather than the end of the tale?
Well, being a typical New England John Adams puritanical type focusing on doom and gloom, I guess my answer is yes. I hate to end on a sour note. But right now, I don't see the prospects for reform being all that strong. And I do think there's a distinct possibility in either party of somebody who's arguably, although it's hard to envision this, worse than Trump. Look, in 2016, you almost had a situation. Bernie Sanders came this close to defeating Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders isn't then or now a member of the Democratic Party. He never has been. Yeah. And he almost secured its nomination. Donald Trump was never an active member of the Republican Party. He did secure its nomination. So he and Sanders, in a way, are personification of the triumph of Wilson's primary system. Now, Will, you make a fantastic point. I've had to wrestle with this. Without Wilson's system, you would not have seen Barack Obama in 2008. You would not, by the way, have seen John F. Kennedy in 1960. He was not the choice of party leaders. I just wrote a book on JFK, mostly admirable, other than his personal peccadillos. But Kennedy was not the choice of party leaders. And there is a strong case to be made that JFK, Obama, some of the Reagan, perhaps, some of the other nominees who were not the choice of party leaders brought a new enthusiasm, a new vitality into the system. And I don't have a good answer for you other than I guess I do have an answer for you. I'm not sorry. I've got this bug here that's flying
That's
around.
okay. No problem.
He doesn't like what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We did end up with
Wilson was reincarnated into a fly or something.
Yeah. We did end up with a Donald Trump. I'm not prepared to live with that risk. I think we're really playing with fire. We need some guardrails. We need some filtering. I think the party leadership should be able to do that in both political parties. But again, the position I'm taking, I don't think is shared by most Americans.
Right, and I'm wrestling it with it myself because it's not that sophisticated in my mind. It's like democracy good, democracy bad. Both things are true. How do you find a balance? And it leads to some wrestling. And so in our last couple of minutes, I did want to wrestle with some potential solutions because you proposed a couple in your book, and I wanted to ask about an alternative. So let me ask about your thoughts first. Because maybe ours overlap anyway. You argued for stronger political parties, which you just alluded to. So the idea that, things that people right now use as boogeyman words like super delegate might actually once again be super. And then second, the renovation of the Electoral College, which is something I think the vast majority of people would say, like, are you freaking nuts? Like what?
That right. My wife even says that to me, Will.
Yeah. So could you just tell me a little bit about that, and I'll just skip ahead and tell you what I would propose, and maybe maybe I'm copying you anyway. Maybe you said it in the book, but I also think that a good counterbalance to this might just simply be making Congress stronger again.
Yeah.
And a renaissance in congressional power. So what do you think are some remedies that might help to counterbalance this progression that we're on and maintain a sense of democracy that people have now come to expect, right? The cat's kind of out of the bag.
Yeah. Look, I understand my idea that we should go back to the original conception of the Electoral College. I mean, if I were to convene a convention of people who supported that, we'd be meeting in a broom closet. There's probably 3 other people in the country who share my view. So that's not going to happen. Again, I settle on, as you mentioned, restoring party strength, restoring the superdelegates. I don't even know if that'll happen. I'm skeptical of that as well, because the problem will, and this is the tougher aspect of trying to change this. Ultimately, this is all on us. The American people keep falling for candidates who promise them the world, candidates who have a conception of presidential power that is just not realistic and leads to further disillusionment in the public's faith in government. But every 4 years, we fall for this, and we'll do it again probably this fall. It's on us to sort of take the focus off the American presidency, which would have the benefit, hopefully, of restoring Congress to its appropriate role. They've been neutered as a result of many of these Wilsonian reforms, because Congress is now expected to follow the lead. If your guy's in the White House, you follow his lead. You stick with him, whether it's on impeachment or whether it's on matters of war and peace. If the other guy's party is in power, you break with them. That's not the way it was supposed to work. For separation of powers to work, Congress has to be something of a separate body. And so that's going to require not just members of Congress, again, but all of us rethinking our view of presidential power, rethinking our view of the role of Congress, of refusing to support candidates who promise us the world and appeal to our base, our lowest passions. Now, again, that's a long-term project that's going to require a lot of civic education, which I spend a lot of time on trying to do. Again, in my more optimistic days, which are few and far between, I hope that the work that I'm doing and so many other civics teachers at the elementary and collegiate level and high school level are doing will pay dividends, but we're talking decades down the road.
Right. And I think that there is some hope in the idea that Congress can be a more powerful check. I think that, or at least I find that that's perhaps like the path where I could actually see it going forward, that rather than taking the emphasis off the presidency, creating more emphasis on the Congress seems like something that could happen over time. But that just leaves us something to talk about next time. So on that note, last thing before I hit the end record button for the audience here, did I fail to ask you a question that you would have asked if you were me? Is there something about the presidency that I've missed that was really important?
Yeah, geez. I mean, I already made my plug for William Howard Taft, which most presidential scholars won't give him the time of day. Well, look, I don't want your listeners to think that the book is sort of totally focused on the negative. I do, in addition to Taft, discuss John Quincy Adams, who I see as a very healthy alternative to the demagogic presidency of Andrew Jackson. Jackson runs circles around John Quincy Adams due to his demagoguery, due to his public appeal. But John Quincy Adams, to me, is a symbol of the way the presidency should function. So I would say John Quincy Adams, Dwight Eisenhower. I have some positive things to say about Eisenhower as well. I've already mentioned Taft, and I'll mention one other president that I devote at least a couple of pages to, and that's Ulysses S. Grant, who for the most part, up until recently, had been ranked fairly low among scholars, but has since made a comeback. And he does take a fairly bold stand for his time on civil rights. And part of the reason Grant has begun to climb back up on those polls, whether you believe in those polls or not, I do think it's deserved, is because he spends some political capital, at least in his first term, trying to break the Ku Klux Klan in the South, trying to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And for that reason, he deserves our praise. So again, I just want to, if you ask me, about adding something that you didn't ask, I've tended to focus today on the negatives. There are a few positive examples, and those presidents I just mentioned are the positive examples.
And we already talked about Hamilton and Jefferson. These are people that were, they like Jefferson kind of seems like small government guy, but is actually the more populist of the two. And Hamilton seems like the big government guy, but has the longer view. What's the Walt Whitman quote about contradictions? I mean, obviously, if you write a book called The Lost Soul, it does have a negative twist, but nobody writes that if they're not someone who despairs or who is worried or who wants better. So I think that that's good that you point out that there's optimism there. There is a desire for better, and that the presidency, finding the right balance of the presidency is ultimately about building a democratic republic with justice built into the system and stability for that justice. So we're all coming from the right place here, and I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with me, and I hope we get to talk again. So I'm going to say a preliminary goodbye to Dr. Knott, but we're going to end the recording, and we can say our proper goodbyes after I hit the button. So thanks, everyone, if you made it this far, and keep an eye out for Stephen F. Knott on my YouTube channel.